also accompany the text with much more detailed and extensive syllabi, schedules, and outline and review material than is typical in a traditional class. After a student enrolls, and once they've secured all the accompanying materials and arranged to have an internet address, they're ready to begin. They can do work for the class at any time that is convenient for them and from any computer which has a modem and a telephone connection. They log on to their home account, and there they find communications from the instructor and from their classmates. Some of the communications will be formal instructional material, schedules, assignments, study or review questions, which will guide them through the activities required for the course. Other messages will be informal. If the student has a question, it can be sent as an email message to the instructor. Then when the instructor checks his or her email account, this and all other student questions will be there, and the instructor responds to each individually. Assignments can be prepared as text documents and sent to the instructor for correcting and grading, and then returned to the student. Since all students in a class have the email addresses for all their classmates, communication among students is as easy as with the instructor. Many of our online students report that they have much more and better interaction with both instructor and classmates in the online environment than in a classroom. Student response to this new delivery method has been very positive. Every section offered so far has been fully enrolled, and completion rates compare favorably with on-campus sections. We've been pleased to note the number of students who are taking courses at their workplace, and we've received enthusiastic feedback from employers who are glad to have the opportunity for their employees to receive education and training at the job site without the necessity of time-consuming travel or of finding space at their place of business for classes. One of the developments about which we're most excited is the opportunity for international connections. This semester, as part of an informal pilot exchange project, approximately 20 students in Russia and the Ukraine are taking front-range courses via the Internet. From our first online offering, an English composition course, we have expanded into several other disciplines. This semester we're offering 2 composition classes, a speech course, and a course in Unix computer programming. We're currently developing several new computer science courses, as well as courses in American history and psychology. Our business department is eager to venture into this new arena with its potential for professional and business training. They are looking at their whole curriculum with courses in business, management, finance, and entrepreneurship for online delivery. The success we have enjoyed with our online courses so far is gratifying, but we know we're only at the beginning of the development of a new kind of instruction. As we gain more experience and continue to develop and refine our methods, and especially as some of the exciting new technical developments that are appearing every day become accessible, we can expect this program to grow into the future. We look forward to that future with confidence.
As you can tell, developing an academic or training class takes a lot of prior planning. As the developer, you must first decide exactly what you want your learners to know at the conclusion of the training session. Then, design all your instructional elements to support those learning goals. If the actual training session is conducted in real time, that is, it is a live session like this seminar, the time the instructor spends with the learners will probably be shorter than what might be the case in a face-to-face session. As we all know, it takes a lot more time to write a short, well-constructed speech or paper than a long one. We have to consider each word and its effectiveness in the shorter piece, and we give up the luxury of being able to ramble through our themes. Consequently, it does take more time to plan even the lecture portion of the training session for learners at a distance. Another critical part of the planning relates to the support materials, readings or handouts for the learners. Those need to be distributed well in advance of the actual electronic training session, and it is a good idea to have an alternative plan for those sites whose mail delivery might be a little slow or whose fax machine might be broken that day. Finally, if a follow-up electronic discussion is anticipated using electronic mail or email, it is very important that the instructor or facilitator of that discussion realize how important it is to respond to questions and comments online in a prompt manner. The usual rule of thumb is within 48 hours, That means spending time each day in virtual conversation with the other discussants. Since these type of follow-up discussions are very time-consuming for the instructor, it's best to limit the number of days that learners will be able to participate. Limiting the follow-up discussion to a few weeks following the training session seems to be useful for all the participants. As we'll see in a few minutes, this type of computer-mediated communication seems to be very effective in a wide range of subject areas for students at many levels and many different levels of sophistication. Let me share with you one more example of a distance learning project that has integrated all of these elements to serve rural areas of California. This is a project involving 5 campuses of the California State University system, with teaching originating from each campus, but reaching over 25 rural communities and their high schools throughout the state. They are using taped lectures, lots of print materials, audio conferences that are scheduled at critical times for discussions, and electronic mail wherever the telephone lines can allow it. While the example is one for university classes delivered to advanced high school students, the same components could be used for training employees in companies located in rural areas. Now it's your turn. I'm anxious to hear your questions and comments and would be glad to provide more details of the examples that we've just talked about if you're interested.
Let's begin the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which now appear on your screen. We also ask that you stay as far away from your monitor as possible to avoid feedback interference with your call. We have a fax already from the Universidad Tecnológica de Panamá. The question is, what direct benefits can developing countries obtain through distance education modules, and what mechanisms are necessary to implement them? Sally, John?
Well, I'm really pleased to hear there's someone out there really watching. This is our first real evidence here. And that's an excellent question. I think the biggest issue that I've already mentioned is this whole notion of reaching people who otherwise would never have an opportunity to have access to high-quality learning materials. And I can't say that there's a greater benefit than that. In terms of the mechanisms, I think the first critical part of that is really having teams of people who are the experts who organize this whole project, and I'm calling it a project because that's really what it becomes, to organize the materials, to organize the technology, to organize the ways in which the students will be supported, and then we have to deal with some of the technologies. And those can be dealt with, as I've mentioned, also in a variety of ways. It may be print-based with some audio components. There may be computer links and networks, or there may be standalone computer systems that are dealt with through other ways. And then there's always the video or the television, such as we're using today. John, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, just an observation. A few years ago, I was involved in a distance education project in rural sections of Africa, in developing countries in rural sections of Africa. And the question then was how to reach the villages where there was very limited telecommunication facility available, no telephone service, no genuine service in a modern sense. However, the countries, both countries that I was involved in, did have a national radio system. And everybody has a transistor radio, and that was a mechanism that could be used effectively to reach, at least to start the process, and it worked very well.
We have a second question, this one from Senac in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The question concerns the use of distance education to solve transmission difficulties, but also the real question is, when will it be possible for these systems to become a dialogue, to become bidirectional, where there's complete interaction in both directions?
One of the things to take into account is how to make it a dialogue. If we're looking at a large number of people in a large number of sites, a dialogue in the usual sense of the word is very difficult under any circumstances. However, in the example that people just saw with Steve Tilson in Colorado, where a computer system was set up, a dialogue not all happening at the same time, but a genuine interaction not only between students and faculty, but among students, becomes very feasible and can be accomplished with really quite a large number of people in what seems to be a genuine dialogue.
Sally?
I think to sort of echo that a little bit, if we considered our example today, I understand there are probably about 90 sites involved in our distance learning activity here. And it would be very difficult, I think, for us to manage a two-way dialogue. However, there are networks and systems that are not only designed but are actually in practice that do allow you to do that. Maybe not terribly effectively with this large a group, but with smaller groups where you have perhaps a dozen or so sites simultaneously being able to interact, if you will. And the mechanism that does that is really to change the nature of the technical signal and to make it available over a lower bandwidth or a lower area in which, through a phone line or through a satellite transmission, it's exceedingly less costly than it is to have the full high quality signal.
We have a fax from Mexico City from the Department of Veterinary Medicine at UNAM. The question concerns the modification of knowledge that happens here. Does distance education call for a new curriculum?
I would insist that the curriculum should be set by the question of what should be learned. Distance education, however, suggests a number of different ways to deliver the curriculum. And so I would characterize it as a change in pedagogy, but not a change in curriculum.
Again, echoing, you can see we disagree a lot on a number of things here. Echoing John's comment, as one rethinks this pedagogy, again, not the whole curriculum, but the pedagogy itself, one needs to take into consideration what types of activities could students engage in, maybe locally, for which they didn't need the expert present all of the time, and build those into the broad range of materials that would be available to the students, so that the students are at some times using these live and interactive technologies or these what I tend to call non-real-time activity or interactions, such as John mentioned with the computer conferencing, to be able to accomplish things that don't require the highest cost.
We have a fax from the Instituto Tecnológico in Tepic, Nayarit. Welcome to our colleagues in Tepic. The question has to do with when groups of students are a long way from the instructor, don't they feel isolated? Is there a psychological dimension to this?
There's a psychological dimension to it which has some very interesting components. One of the things that people often find is that they become a community of their own. That is, people in the distance site tend to interact with one another well, support one another well, have a kind of common approach to the home institution and to the instructor. And one of the things that's a fact of life in many of these distance learning programs is that the interaction among the students and then between the students and the instructor takes on a somewhat richer character than in a traditional classroom. So I think one of the real advantages of many of these techniques is that the students themselves become a very useful learning community.
I'll say a little bit more about this when we get into the second module, but again, I think it's critical to keep in mind that this is changing the way in which the students are able to interact with one another, and I think it's incumbent on the organizing group, that is the faculty member or the institution or that team I mentioned before that is really putting all this together, to help the students understand how they can establish this kind of community that John was just mentioning. And that community may not take the form of people ever getting together face to face. It may mean those students have access to one another through other kinds of mechanisms, through mail or through computer conferencing or through telephone lines or a variety of other means. But in essence, the organizing group needs to facilitate that and to help the students understand how to do that. And as soon as they're given license, we've found that students jump in and become, as John has said, a very rich community that do support one another.
We have a phone call from Tepic, our colleagues at the Instituto Tecnológico in Tepic. Welcome to our teleconference. What is your question?
Very well. Well, I am calling from Tepic. My question is a very direct one for Dr. Johnstone, and it's the following. Do you think that the electronic media could supplant the teacher because of the efficiency and quality?
No. Never. I think what's very important to keep in mind is that the teacher is always the brain behind whatever is going on. I do happen to believe that the role of the teacher may well change as technology becomes more pervasive, as technologies become more available. The role of the teacher will become less one of, let me take a typical training or university setting example, of coming into a lecture hall and performing, if you will, the same lecture to a number of students term after term after term, and instead the instructor or the teacher will have an opportunity to think in the scope of how he or she wants these students to learn. And perhaps some of what that teacher will do will in fact be put onto videotape so that that teacher doesn't have to do the same things over and over. Or we may find that what the teacher chooses to do is to organize learning modules for students in ways that encourage the student to work more on his or her own and use the time with the teacher as a very special and very pointed time for interaction, and more along the lines of the old Greek model of the Socratic method, if you will, where the teacher is actually drawing out the student after the student has engaged in a lot of learning on his or her own. So no, I don't think these technologies will ever take the teacher out of the picture, but it may well change and make much more rewarding what the teacher does.
We have a call from Mexico City, from the Comisión Federal de Electricidad in Atoyac. Welcome. What is your question, please?
Gracias. When you use distance educate or communication, don't you think that people become a little colder and that the emotional aspect does not develop and that your interaction becomes more like a machine instead of that of a human being? On the other hand, how can you recognize the degree of knowledge that a student has acquired, and how can you locate that particular student in a certain grade or year or level?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to start that one. The fact is that the general experience of people who have been doing this kind of thing is not that the situation becomes less personal. One of the things that happens is that the technology tends to facilitate a personal interaction. And this is true whether we can see one another or whether the interaction takes place through a computer system or by some other means. The relationship, particularly between the student and the professor or among the student group, tends to become really quite personal. And I think the general experience is that this is... It seems in the abstract as if that would be the case, as if the technology somehow would be depersonalizing. In fact, when one uses it, it turns out not to be the case. It turns out that we can communicate with one another really quite well.
I'm going to take this opportunity to, I think, the first time ever disagree with you a little bit.
Okay.
But just a little bit. And I would suggest that everything John has said is really very true, and we have lots of evidence and experiences to support it. But there are some exceptions, and I think the environment in which we're working right now is somewhat of an exception. We're asking you to ask a question, or to keep your comments rather brief so that so many people will have an opportunity to share their questions or their comments. And in this case, I think it does become a little less personal. However, I would suggest to you that if all of you were here in San Diego right now, number one, you probably wouldn't fit in this room, but if we could find a space on the campus of San Diego State University, and we had all of you in one place at one time, it would be just as impersonal as we find this mechanism. When one is dealing with huge numbers of people and a few experts, if you will, you end up perforce having to, in essence, limit the time that any one person has to interact with that person, the teacher. And given that that is the case, I think we need to then just translate that into the technological environment. And when we design a technological environment that mimics that face-to-face setting, we can't expect anything more from it.
We have a call from the Centro Universitario de la Costa in Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco. Welcome, and what is your question?
Good morning. My question is as follows. How can you overcome the language barrier through the computer network in order to communicate between instructor and student worldwide in an interactive education, and to be a little more efficient in communication? That's the question.
That's a
good one.
Good one, and it's one on which some work is being done. Actually, the question of language is, of course, one that we're confronted with today. And on a computer network, it's actually somewhat more manageable from 2 points of view. One, my Spanish is terrible, but if I were writing it, I could do a little better. Second, however, there are some language translation programs which are beginning to be quite effective. And so actually doing a multilingual presentation by computer is presently more feasible than doing it the way we're doing it today.
We have a call from our neighbors in Tijuana, the Universidad Iberoamericana, Campus Noroeste. Welcome. Your question.
Is it possible to have a whole career through distance education? Have you any knowledge of any experience in the area of health, for example?
Yes, a little bit.
Sí.
Let's see. If we look at the health professions, the direct experiences that we have right now, or the information that I have right now, usually is in the form of less original or primary training and more at what we might think of as continual training and to upgrade one's skills. I do know of several states within the United States that are offering people who have let's say a 2-year nursing degree, the opportunity to turn that into a baccalaureate level degree, which here means a complete 4 or 5-year nursing degree. And they do that by building on the local hospital facilities in the area where the student is, and then using either a video satellite transmission, or in some cases it's a lot of print material and audio links to assist those nursing students who are already working in a hospital environment to upgrade their skills and to go further with their education. John, do you have other comments?
Only that the technology is also sometimes used to support the health professions in other ways. And, for instance, teleradiology and that sort of thing, transmitting X-rays and other diagnostic materials by electronic means. And while that's not directly in response to your question with regard to distance education, those same techniques can be used in an education sense to help upgrade the skills that one has already acquired.
There is also, I think, in the bibliography, a publication that John and I both worked on that examined some of the issues that have to do in the medical professions in the use of distance learning and, to some extent, telecommunications for these more advanced applications.
Right.
So I would refer you to that if you need further information.
And, of course, that publication is available through your organization.
Okay.
We have a call from the Universidad Tecnológica de Nezahualcóyotl in the state of Mexico. Welcome to our show. Your question.
As regards the distance education courses that are using now Internet, do you know what would be the total cost for the student per course? And in your case, can you give us an idea about what the course of this nature would cost, structurally speaking?
Is that person still online?
Do you wish a clarification?
Yeah, I need a clarification. How much would it cost for a student approximately to pay for a continuous education course when he is using this kind of using the Internet and distance education means?
Okay.
Fortunately or unfortunately, there isn't a fixed cost, and one has to look at the specifics to really understand it. If we're talking about a student who is in a large city and has ready access, say, to a library where he or she can go to acquire a direct link into the Internet, then at least that piece of it is taken care of. If, however, the student is in a more rural environment where he or she must somehow have access to a sufficiently high grade of a telephone line, there are some other costs that will be incurred. Those organizations and schools right now that are offering Internet-based courses are doing so in a variety of ways. In some cases, they're absolutely free, that's in quotes, to the student, because recognize that it is dependent on the student to be able to get into the network. And in other cases, there is a fee that the institution charges if the student wants to acquire credit for the course, that is, to actually receive some sort of certification. And that is usually equivalent to what that institution would charge other students to receive credit for their courses under more traditional circumstances. I'm sorry I can't be more specific. John, perhaps you could...
No, since the Internet cost tends not to be an individual cost, it's a little hard to say exactly what it would be in a given situation. It's the institution controls that a lot more than the network, which doesn't really control it at all.
Mm-hmm.
We have a call from Panama, from the Universidad Tecnológica de Panamá. Your question.
We're calling from the Technological University of Panama. In what way have you measured efficiency of distance education programs that you have developed?
That's a good one. Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Quality control is everybody's favorite subject. And one of the things that we need to do is recognize the need to say, how do we measure the efficiency of any course? Not just a distance education course, but any course. And traditionally, there have been a number of ways to do that. In universities, we have accrediting arrangements that the universities subscribe to, which judge the professional worth of the university's curriculum. And much the same technique is applied, needs to be applied, to distance education. With regard to the kind of underlying question of whether the course offered through distance education is academically equivalent to the same course being offered in a conventional classroom, the research is really quite consistent and has been for the last 30 years. That is, the medium makes really very little difference. It's the quality of the instruction itself that matters. A good course or a bad course can be offered using any technology, including the classroom and a blackboard. And what we need to do is assure that courses that are offered by means of technology, whether it's this or computers or whatever, are academically rigorous and and fully appropriate to the curriculum intended by the institution. And that's something that needs to be done by good instructors and good teams of people developing the course.
There's a few other issues here to, again, echo John.